In this last section of the lecture, I want to focus on the Chinese tradition, where we see a slightly different pattern than we saw with the Jodo Shinshu Pure Land school in Japan that pushes the other power element to the max. In China, what happened is that about 1,000 years ago, there were some purges of Buddhism, and in that process, the various different Chinese schools of Buddhism that had developed up to that point, they no longer continued to exist as separate traditions. And some of the ideas were worked into a more generic form, and the two most dominant elements are Chan and Pure Land, but other elements certainly exist. And by the way, the schools from China that had settled in Japan, those schools maintained a separate, distinct identity and still do to this day. So in Japan you have a variety of different schools of Buddhism, but we can't get into all the details right now. So looking at China, you can see with the yin-yang image of self-power and other power that the two are complementary rather than choose self-power or choose other power. And that's very much been the dominant way that Buddhism has been practiced in China for the past 1,000 years and still very much today. The idea here is that despite what seem to be opposite approaches, that they really combine together on the same central task, which is to eliminate the ego, right? Because if you could get rid of the ego, then you would realize your interconnectedness with all things, or to put it in a Chinese way, as well as other East Asian forms of Buddhism, they would talk about Buddha nature. The terminology changes a little bit, but the idea is essentially the same. What Buddha nature means is that our true nature is our interconnectedness with all things, and it's through that we have the potential to become a Buddha. And so in the Chinese versions, you can think about the Chan approach as pursuing a specific path where you're going to work towards eliminating ego through meditation primarily, but other things as well. And of course, borrowing very heavily from the Taoist idea of a kind of emptiness meditation where you empty the mind, and when the mind is empty, you can connect with the Tao, which is ultimately the interconnectedness of Buddha nature. So that's one approach. And then you have the Pure Land approach, where you are using faith to connect with the power of the Pure Land Buddha and thereby attain rebirth in the Pure Land. And there certainly are a great many people in the Chinese tradition, the lay people who have a very basic sense that they want to be reborn in the Pure Land. But when you talk to monks and people who have a little more sophisticated perspective on Buddhism, they will say that the two paths are really the same because they're both just doing the same thing. They're helping you to get rid of ego. Now, it's easier to see that in the case of Chan, you meditating and emptying the mind and thereby letting go of your attachment to desire and ego, much the way the Buddha did. That seems pretty straightforward. But can you see how that's true in the case of other power as well? And I would suggest to you that it looks something like this. When you try to attain awakening through your own efforts, you're still holding on to a part of your ego, the sense that I can do it through my own efforts. Whereas if you look at the Jodo Shinshu approach, where any hint of I can do it myself is eliminated, it helps us to see what's really going on in even the faith-based approach to Pure Land Buddhism. And that is that you give up all sense that you can do it through your own efforts and rely on the power of the Pure Land Buddha, but in so doing, you are letting go of your ego, because it's the ego that thinks that it can do things through its own power. And so they're really just two different ways to get at the same ultimate goal of getting rid of the ego. And in that sense, you certainly will get a different answer if you talk to a Chan Buddhist who really specializes in that particular approach. They're probably going to say there is no pure land that is a separate place that you can be reborn in, that it's only symbolic, that this is the pure land right here, that if you're a Buddha and you see things from an enlightened perspective, then this is already everything that you need right here in this imperfect world. But it's kind of perfect from a Buddhist perspective if you have the eyes of a Buddha. So that's the Chan or Zen slant on it, whereas a Pure Land Buddhist might believe that you can be reborn in a Pure Land, but that doesn't mean that they would say that you don't have to engage in any kind of significant Buddhist practice. And so what you typically see in Chinese schools of Buddhism, typified by the Foguangshan tradition, there's this temple in Naperville that is one of the options for you to go to see a Buddhist service. You really see a real combination. If you go to that service, you'll engage in certain practices that involve, or you can just watch them, that involve sutra recitation, people reciting sutras, and in the belief partially that reciting the sutras is helpful in an other power kind of way. But you also see very, very clearly that they're deeply concerned with the meaning. That chanting the sutra is a practice that helps you to transform yourself. And there will always be a Dharma talk where the nun in charge of that temple will always give a lecture on Buddhist principles and tell you about the things that you should do in your life to put Buddhism into practice. And so there's this very strong sense in this Chinese tradition of mixing both the faith elements and the self-power elements together. And if you want to see what that looks like, go to Foguangshan. That would be a good option. Lastly, I want to say something about a Japanese tradition. This one did not come from China, as most of the Japanese Buddhist traditions originally did, but rather was developed by a Tendai monk named Nichiren. And he ultimately was dissatisfied with the Tendai approach and left to start his own tradition. It focuses on the Lotus Sutra. And as we were talking about at the beginning of this broader lecture on other power in Pure Land today, that the Lotus Sutra was particularly important. It's an early sutra, and the idea that by having a kind of faith in the sutra, or reciting it, or paying others to recite it or copy it, and those kinds of things, that could have some kind of an other power effect. And we see this kind of combination of the self-power and other power in the Nichiren school because of this object here, which is called the Gohonzon, the sacred object. And it is, the original version of it was written by Nichiren, and it has the name of the sutra in the center, right down the middle, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. And that is the name of the Lotus Sutra, and around it are different characters from the sutra, including Nichiren's name is on there. And what it represents is the text itself. And so just like we saw earlier that the text has a kind of inherent magical power, you could reduce the power of the whole sutra just to this one object, the Gohonzon. And the way that you would practice is that you would chant not Namu Amida Butsu, that would be the Pure Land version, but you chant Nam Myoho Renge Kyo over and over, in sometimes slow, sometimes fast, and there are also some bits of sutras that get recited. But this daimoku, as it's called in the tradition of Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, that is the central practice, and you do it in front of this object that is a kind of a conduit. It's as if the Buddha is present right there in the room or temple where you are practicing, and as you're chanting, it's like your energy is going out to the Buddha, and then you're receiving a pure kind of energy back. And through that practice, you can purify your mind. And so we see something similar in Nichiren Buddhist practice, that it's a combination. There's certainly some strong faith elements there, a sense that that through this kind of practice that the Buddha will be able to help you to attain awakening. But they also have a very, very strong sense of you don't get transformed unless you study the sutras and put them into practice in your life. So it still has very much of that self-power kind of feeling to it. If you want to hear some of that chanting in a very beautiful voice, many of you probably know who Tina Turner is. She's a Nichiren Buddhist, and there's a little bit of an interview here, and she talks a bit about how she came to be a Buddhist, but then she does some beautiful chanting. She's one of the world's greatest singers, so she has a wonderful voice. So you can watch that. And lastly, we have two different communities in the area. One of them is about 15 minutes from here. That's the one on the bottom. That's the one on the top. Myogyoji is in Bartlett, about 15 minutes from here. And they practice Nichiren Buddhism. They have priests. And so this is one of the official lineages that were passed down from Nichiren himself. And if you want to have a very interesting experience chanting, or you can just observe other people chanting, but it's wonderful to do the chanting yourself. It's very simple. It's not hard to learn that simple phrase, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And when you chant it over and over again for 20 minutes, it really feels like you stop chanting and something is resonating in you and chanting through you, which is getting back to that other power idea, that's part of the way that it's effective, because it's helping to let go of your attachment to ego and experience something other kind of working through you. So that's a wonderful place to go and visit. I will warn you that they are a tradition that proselytizes. That is to say, they will probably try and convert you in some way or another. Nothing too terrible, but in general, Buddhism is not a tradition that strongly proselytizes. So if you go to pretty much any other Buddhist temple in the Chicago area, they're not going to try and convert you to Buddhism. They'll be happy to share their tradition with you, but they won't sort of push it on you. You might experience that there, and if that's something that you're not interested in and you want to avoid, then Pure Land, Nichiren Buddhism may not be the option for you to try. I want to mention briefly the second community. This one you'd have to go to Chicago. It's called Soka Gakkai, and it is originally associated with Nichiren Buddhism as a lay movement, but over time they had a kind of a falling out, and Soka Gakkai continued as a separate tradition. It does not have a priesthood, so it's almost like a Protestant tradition, if you want to think about it that way, as sort of splitting off from the priestly tradition into one where everybody has the ability to attain this for themselves. It is a major worldwide movement, as is Nichiren Buddhism. You can look at the pictures and see that most of the people who are practicing these two kinds of Buddhism are not of Japanese descent. Some of them are, but mostly they are not. And it's not just in America. This is all over the world. Both forms, Nichiren and Soka Gakkai, both of them are very popular forms of Buddhism to practice. So that brings this part of the lecture to the end, but the last question for you to reflect on and write that little paper on is Pure Land Buddhism consistent with the original teachings of the Buddha? Why or why not? You can, of course, answer that however you want. But what I'm trying to get at here is that if we think about the Pure Land tradition as having this element of letting go of the ego, maybe that's a way to think of it as connecting back to what the Buddha taught, even though on the surface the Buddha taught a very self-power oriented kind of Buddhism.